I will be dead in the ground and have taken a vow to never lay eyes on a screen again before I admit that the boss battles of Final Fantasy XVI are subpar. These are some of the most cinematic, explosive, and over-the-top fights I have seen in all of gaming. We have genuinely achieved anime fights with intense realism shaded over them. I mean, the Titan fight alone is like if Jotaro vs Dio, All Might vs All For One, and Eren vs Reiner had a baby that was raised on watching Luffy vs Lucci on repeat for 10 years. Hell, I wish they were calling out their attack names anime style just to make it even more epic, although I suppose that might come across as a bit silly coming from what is basically live-action character models at this point. I have never been more invested in a boss battle than my fight against Bahamut. Just when I thought it couldn't get any crazier than fighting a dragon in space, he whips out a Zeta Flare and my jaw is on the floor at the sheer power and scale that is being represented on screen. Each of these battles is a phenomenal set piece that raises the bar for action in games well past what Devil May Cry and Asura's Wrath had previously set it at. But I feel as though the cinematic ambition of all these magnificent boss fights betrays them in a way that is the cause of much ire: QuickTime events. There are a lot of people who are much smarter than me that bemoan QTEs in any form, and while I agree that they're lazy and a cheap way to keep the player engaged in a cutscene most of the time, they can be used effectively. For example, surprising a player with a jump scare followed by a QTE in a horror game is a great way of blending gameplay with tropes of the genre. Of course, said horror game needs to be dripping with atmosphere, and the player needs to expect something to lurch out at them for it to not feel cheap. The reason I don't like QTEs is that they rob the player of what would otherwise be engaging gameplay, and it's almost identical to watching a cutscene, which defeats the purpose of the game being interactive. Would you rather basically watch your character kill the monster, or would you rather do it yourself? Or there's the even worse kind of QTE that happens during a cutscene when the player isn't prepared or might be looking at their phone. But don't worry, only an insufferable jackass who imagines every player playing their games on the edge of their seat with their eyes glued to the screen would use that trick all the time. Isn't that right, David Cage? Final Fantasy XVI is the type of game with bad QTEs, because they rob the player of gameplay in what is otherwise completely interactive kaiju battles, the likes of which we've never seen. I also think QTEs aren't all that difficult to change into gameplay. It's relatively easy. All you have to do is give an audio cue, like the main character saying, "I've got to dodge that," or "Can't let it hit me," and then train the player to dodge themselves, without switching to a cutscene or having a button prompt appear on the screen. It's sure to kill the player the first couple of times, but it would train them to interact with the scripted boss attacks on their own. Then you start taking the audio cues away, and letting the player figure out what the right course of action is based on the experience they've had with the game so far. Imagine if when Bahamut is launching Zeta Flare, you have a choice of how to deal with it. You could dodge and get a fail state where all of Valsithia is destroyed. You could charge at it and stop it and get incinerated. Or you could make the correct choice and charge up an attack and stop it dead in its tracks. Or there could even be multiple correct answers to dealing with the threat. Imagine how cool it would be if you could interact with those cinematic moments in your own way and you dealt with them in a different way than your friends. It wouldn't be hard to create a few alternative ways for a player to end their god-level threat boss fights, and it would elevate Final Fantasy XVI's boss fights from legendary to the unequaled best of all time. It's already been proven that QTEs can be translated into gameplay. Look at the Resident Evil 4 remake, turning the infamous Krauser knife fight into a proper boss, and if you can do that, I don't think there's a lot of QTEs you can't make into interactive battles. It's kind of obvious why Final Fantasy XVI made the choice to have all of its major boss battles so QTE heavy. It's trying to emulate huge AAA Western games, and with its gigantic cinematic scope, they've made a choice between a game and a game trying to be a movie. They made the wrong choice in my opinion. and like the movie it's trying to be, it wants to take you on the journey that it's laid out. That's fine for mission structures and guiding the story along specific paths you want it to, but in boss fights there isn't a lot of storytelling going on, it's pure spectacle, so it doesn't make sense for you to be guiding us through this part of the game too. Freedom of approach is a massive part of what makes previous Final Fantasy boss fights so amazing. Choosing whether you want to suplex the Phantom Train or simply use the Phoenix Down is what makes that battle so memorable. And while Final Fantasy XVI's bosses are anything but forgettable, how it robs you of interacting with its most extraordinary moments in a meaningful way is a large blemish on these otherwise pristine boss fights.